So the best thing for me now would be to imagine I'm having a music lesson with a maestro, which I've had sometimes. And they're usually, you tell them what you need to know, and then they add the stuff in that you don't know. Is that good for you?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Or I'm joining your class at uni. Have I done my summer studying? So, well, in brief, Guy, see if I've got this correct. The biosphere is collapsing. So my understanding is 90% of flying insects have gone, as measured in Germany, and that's worldwide.
And also measured in one of the islands in the Caribbean. I can't remember which one.
Yeah, and somewhere in the Amazon, 90% of the plankton have gone as measured in the equatorial Atlantic recently. Is that widespread?
Yes, absolutely.
How do you know?
Well, it isn't just in one location that the measurements have been made, although the peer-reviewed literature is very slow to catch up with the reality of the situation. Okay. Peer-reviewed papers are stunningly conservative, something that most people don't understand. And that's because of the way the process works and the nature of the people who are submitting the papers. You don't have a career in academia unless you're prepared to be very conservative for that entire career. It can be very costly to take a less conservative route, to make mistakes in projections or predictions that fail to turn out correct is a prescription for utter disaster in an academic life.
Understood, but they're not publishing the measurements at the moment. Right. So coral reef loss and kelp forest loss is also around about 90%. Is that true?
Yes, that's right. And you know, I have friends who have seen the Great Barrier Reef and who won't go there anymore because they know how bad it is. And they saw that it was disintegrating when they were there 20, 25 years ago. And now, just based on what they read, what they see, they won't go to the reef because they want to keep it in their mind, the relatively intact reef that they saw.
Understood.
It's just devastating for anybody who loves any aspect of the living planet to experience what we're going through right now.
Sure. And so tree die-off is also heartbreakingly and widespread now.
Right. And that's not a big surprise because the most important factor in the survival and health of individuals and therefore ecosystems is the rate of environmental change. We and most other species are capable of adapting to relatively slow rates of environmental change. But the fast stuff, like we're going through now, I mean, let's just consider the intergovernmental panels on climate.
Must we, Guy?
We know that the IPCC is stunningly conservative. In fact, it's better referred to as a political body than as a scientific body. And there's a paper in the peer-reviewed journal Bioscience, March 2019, called Statistical Language Backs Conservatism in Climate Change Assessments, and it focuses specifically on the IPCC, and it points out that the IPCC is stunningly conservative, and this from the very conservative peer-reviewed literature. Bioscience, in particular, is a peer-reviewed source that comes out only once a month, so it tends to be about as conservative as any of them. And yet, according to the global warming of 1.5 degrees put out by the IPCC on October 8th, 2018, quote, these global level rates of human-driven change far exceed the rates of change driven by geophysical or biosphere forces that have altered the Earth system trajectory in the past. Even abrupt geophysical events do not approach current rates of human-driven change, end quote. So in other words, because of ongoing anthropogenic climate change, we are causing a rate of environmental change more rapid than anything in planetary history, as nearly as we can tell.
Yeah,
And
understood.
And that's why we're in the midst of a mass extinction event. Although a lot of paid climate scientists and most media personalities will not admit that we are in the midst of a mass extinction event. E.O. Wilson reported it in his 1992 book. You know, this is the father of biodiversity.
Understood, Guy. I've noticed that the nighttime temperatures are staying closer to the daytime temperatures.
Right.
What's the impact of that, and why is that happening?
Well, what's happening because of the urban heat island effect, and the planet is becoming increasingly urbanized. And so all that concrete, steel, and an increased moisture content in a lot of places around the world that retains heat through the night. And
Okay, so as the planet warms, we get more moisture, and that's holding the heat at night.
And also the concrete and steel in urban areas. So an excellent example is found in Phoenix and Tucson, Phoenix, Arizona, Tucson, Arizona. I lived in Tucson for 20 years, and the nighttime temperatures in Tucson dropped dramatically every night, even during the summer, as long as we weren't in the midst of a bunch of monsoonal driven storms. Okay, so as long as it was reasonably dry outside, the temperatures dropped every night. In Phoenix, they haven't done that since World War II, because right after World War II, Phoenix and the city planners decided to pave over all of the arroyos, all of these desert washes, they're called, and convert all that natural ecosystem into concrete. And as a consequence, Phoenix hasn't cooled down at night for 50 years now, relative to Tucson right nearby. And that's because of the urban heat island effect, which was actually described by George Perkins Marsh in the 1800s, I think 1848. So we've known about this for a while, but you know, again, it's one of those things that you don't see a lot of people talk about.
What's the impact on plant growth of the lack of nighttime temperature drop?
Right, and horticulturalists know this because it's really important for plants that you grow for food, like peaches, for example. Every organism that has evolved and currently lives in a temperate location has to have a certain number of hours of cold temperature before they can break dormancy in the spring. If they don't have, and it depends from species to species, depending upon where they are and what kinds of conditions under which they evolved by natural selection. But if you don't experience several thousand hours of temperature below freezing for, say, peach trees in the northwestern United States, then you just don't break bud the following year. So it isn't obvious when it's happening in the winter, but it's obvious in the spring when the plant just doesn't produce any shoots and flowers.
Okay, thank you. Now, in relation to, I don't know if you call it the ecosphere, but the physical world. So we're losing the ice worldwide in the cryosphere enormously.
Right.
The soils are degraded, depleted almost. The rivers, the freshwater rivers are warming in places. The oceans are warming, more in the Arctic than anywhere else.
That all sounds terrible.
Yeah, well, Guy, I'm just, if I speak to people, most people either don't know or don't want to know, and I don't know if I'm correct.
Well, normalcy bias has a lot to do with it. You know, within our lifetime, or slightly more than our lifetime, for you and me, the planet has warmed from 1 degree to 2 degrees. You know, in in a span not much longer than a lifetime. That's how Andrew Glickson puts it in his 2020 book, The Event Horizon. He says, in not much longer than a lifetime, we've experienced this enormous amount of warming. But we're so prone to normalcy bias that as individual human beings, it's difficult for us to know what that means. As far as we're concerned, we get in the car, we drive to work, we get out of the car, we walk into work. It's cool some days and warm some days, but it's only a temperature, a 1 or 2 degrees Celsius temperature difference from day to day. It's not that big a deal. But that's for us driving our cars and going from building to building, from air conditioning to heating or whatever. For the other organisms on the planet, it's a much larger challenge to experience those, what we consider very slow rates of environmental change.
Okay, so what and of course the jet streams have become wildly out of kilter. So what I've been noticing, guys, is a couple of channels I listen to. Some Christian guys report all the news. They think it's biblical, but they're reporting the news. And the floods in Pakistan,
right?
The floods in China, the droughts in the West, the depletion of the aquifers. Some of them are non-renewable, I believe.
Absolutely.
Like major.
Yes, the Ogallala aquifer in the central United States has been being depleted since I was in graduate school. That was 40 years ago, and people were reporting it. And it's absolutely non-renewable at temporal scales relevant to humans. You know, we're talking about an aquifer that took tens of thousands of years to develop, and we're depleting it within 100 years.
Wow. So it looks to me, Guy, like, well, I don't know how civilization is still standing, given the level of impact on the food growth alone.
Right.
How do you account for that?
Well, it is astonishing. And fortunately, there's a lag between environmental change and what plants perceive. Plants in particular, animals too, obviously, but plants are the bottom of the so-called food web. So plants respond quicker than animals do. And so there's a lag for one thing. For another thing, you know, with the pandemic, with COVID-19, we experienced very rapid rates of environmental change in some areas, starting in Wuhan. And peer-reviewed papers have recently, because it takes so long to get a peer-reviewed paper published, they've only recently reported exceptionally high amounts of rainfall in those areas around Wuhan in China. And the same has been reported for moving on from there to the northeastern United States and in areas in Europe. And that's all in places that experienced a slowdown in industrial activities. And therefore, they lost aerosol masking regionally, but not globally yet. And it's a good thing we haven't lost aerosol masking globally, or everybody on the planet would be experiencing what's going on in the places we already talked about, right? Places like China and Pakistan, enormous floods, stunning droughts, these things that are of so-called biblical proportions would be going on throughout the world instead of just occurring in places where we have an opportunity to read about them or see the footage.
I've visited India, which is, as you know, close to Pakistan, and the thought of those millions of people, I know what's coming for them.
Right, absolutely. And
I mean, there's no way out, Guy. They're under 20 foot.
Right. And they're plagued by geography there. They have that, the Himalayas are this enormous mountain range that block cold air coming down from the Arctic. So they don't receive any of that cool air that you and I get living where we live. They only get the warm air coming up from the Indian Ocean, obviously, and the warm, humid air. That's one of the reasons that they're experiencing such difficulties there compared to other places around the world.
One of the things that has been very difficult to manage to respond to reasonably is the movement of the baseline that the environmental community persists in. Um, I, I have no understanding of how anybody with primary school science would shift the baseline and find that okay. So I think you said, Guy, that we're probably 2C above the 1750 baseline now.
Well, that's according to Andrew Glickson in his book, which came out, I think, October 9th, 2020. So he says we have exceeded 2 degrees C, that we're at 2 watts per square meter above the 1750 baseline. So that means more than 2C.
I see. How do you account for the fact that educated, sensible people are moving a baseline?
Children. I think that's a primary factor. I mean, and I'm not sure what I would do if I had children and I wanted things to remain, quote, normal as long as possible. Would I too shift the baseline? Would I say, well, it's not as bad as it seems? I don't know. And you know, if you have a message like mine, which people claim is all doom and gloom, then very few people are willing to listen to that. I get hammered about it every day. People calling me a doomist or a doomist cult hero or blah, 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 you know. And so it certainly is easier to play the role of Pollyanna than it is to point out the facts. And that affects people's individual lives and their employment in those lives. You know, even Professor Michael Mann admitted that early in his career, he took money from the fossil fuel industry. That's what supported his research. Well, I've never received money from the fossil fuel industry in any way, and yet he accuses me of that very frequently.
Wow. That
I'm beholding to the fossil fuel industry, but it's actually him, not me.
Okay. So I think I walk around fields and woods, Guy, and the life which I knew as a child is not there. And my mother, who was born in the early 30s, explained to me when I was little that there were many more butterflies when she was little. She would notice that. So it's just completely clear. So how do you account the complete loss of almost all of the wildlife and the insect life and the plankton and the insects and the plankton base of the food chain? How come that hasn't hit yet? This is one of the things my friends don't understand. I said, It's bound to come because it's gone.
Right, absolutely. Well, you know, very few people spend time in nature like you do, like I do. Most people drive their car from their house to their work in a city, and then from their work to home, and they might go to a restaurant in between. But if your entire life is city life, you haven't noticed that there are no butterflies anymore. You haven't noticed that the pollinators are in decline. Only by being in nature can you observe personally what's going on there in the real world. And most people don't spend their lives there. If seeing a butterfly is a rare event that only happens in your backyard, and that's been the situation for the last 20, 30, 40 years of your life, then you're not going to notice that the rare opportunity to see that butterfly has become even rarer than it was before.
Oh, I see. So what you're saying to me, guys, is the immediacy of their physical experience overrides hearing stories.
Absolutely. You know, if we experience these events, and we rarely are capable of looking to our own past. I remember when I was a kid growing up in northern Idaho, they'd have these cold fronts that would move through across the country from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and it would happen every week or two. We'd have this cold front in the wintertime. So we'd get a lot of snow ahead of the front, and then behind it would just be bitter cold and windy immediately behind. That hasn't happened for decades. But most people don't measure their life over that span of decades. Most people can't remember what it was like when they were 12 years old and things were different than they are now.
Oh,
Right? I mean, this whole set of living arrangements is characterized by its motto: must go faster. Right? Must go
okay.
faster. Must think only about the next few minutes and only about the last few minutes, not about the last few decades. And we certainly don't plan for decades in advance. Right? You know, like other animals, we're day-to-day creatures.
Oh my Lord. That's a true statement. The politicians, I don't think they get back to the next tweet. So when I read about the plankton loss, guys, I was aware of the insects. Thought, well, that is going to hit us soon, and soon, in my estimation, would be, if you're lucky, 2 or 3 seasons.
Right.
What's your take on how? I mean, that's such a huge loss of the base, the food chain. How come it hasn't already all gone?
Right. That's a fine question. And I'm amazed myself. You know, you consider the most conservative of the peer-reviewed literature is the annual reviews, the series of annual, and they come out once a year, the annual. So there's a journal called the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences. It was a 2012 issue that had the paper by Wisław Maslowski and colleagues pointing out the projection of an ice-free Arctic in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. And so it was either 2017 or 2018 that I inaccurately predicted human extinction, because I know about the rapid rate of environmental change that will occur after that first ice-free Arctic event. And fortunately, it hasn't happened yet. 2016, plus or minus 3 years, we dodged 7 bullets and an additional 2 or 3 bullets since then. So and then that's amazing.
Oh, fortunately. So, Guy, I understand what's happening in the Arctic. So, the sea ice extent is measured on the basis of the cells having 15% ice in them. Sam Karana recently wrote, but if you said it needed 50% ice to be actually ice, we're already in a blue ocean event. What do you make of that statement?
Well, no offense to Sam Grana, who has done some very, very good work, but this is one of the reasons I don't follow him anymore, is because that is an extremist statement. He was still predicting an ice-free Arctic Ocean 2 weeks before the autumnal equinox in the Northern Hemisphere. And that didn't make any sense. We've known since April 5th of this year, based on the 6-month forecast from the Naval Postgraduate School. Again, an effort headed by Wisław Maslowski, who, in the wake of that incorrect projection from that paper of theirs published in 2012, they have come up with this 6-month ensemble forecast that is very good. So we've known since April 6th of this year that it was extremely unlikely we would have an ice-free Arctic this year. And yet Sam Carano was predicting that right up until a week before the equinox. And that, for me, that didn't make any sense. So I don't know if Carano is not following the work that is being put out by the Naval Postgraduate School, or just decided it wasn't important. But that was an important piece of evidence, and I look forward every year to the first week or so of April when that prediction is going to come out, because it is very telling. It incorporates many more pieces of information than almost any other work that you'll find anywhere, and it's obviously critically important in terms of albedo and what comes after that.
So do you consider a 15% ice content of a cell of water to be sufficient to maintain radiative function?
It certainly has been so far.
Oh, okay. So it seems to me, Guy, that the movement between La Nina and El Nino is also very critical for how long we can be with each other.
Absolutely.
How
And
do you account for the successive La Ninas?
this is amazing. I think this is just one more outcome of an overheated
luck.
planet. Yeah, well, I think it's one more outcome of an overheated planet. We are locked in this La Nina for this extended period of time, the likes of which we haven't, I don't know if we've ever observed it. To go this long without a strong El Nino event is quite rare, at least in my lifetime. So,
so some of the outcomes of the thing that's going to be produce the end for humanity are actually prolonging the time we've got.
right, absolutely. And so I suspect when we get that next strong El Nino event, we're going to see a lot of greenhouse gases and a lot of heat released by the oceans onto terrestrial surfaces. Then it will be obvious to the plants and also to us that we have catastrophically overheated the planet. But until then, better lucky than good, I guess. We are locked into this cycle of La Ninas or neutral events for a long period of time. And that's working well for us. May it last forever.
And a day. So clearly the methane being released from the shallow Arctic seas is a critical event or a critical process. How do you keep an eye on how much is being emitted?
Well, I follow the Mauna Loa information. It comes every day to my email inbox. So you can check what's going on at Mauna Loa online. And
could you spell that for me, Guy?
Mauna Loa, it's in Hawaii. It's Mauna.
Thank you.
Mauna, and Loa is Loa. Two different words. Two different words. So that's where the United States government first began measuring atmospheric gases and temperatures. And they did so because it's in a relatively remote location. Hawaii is a long way from any continental body. And I'm sure there's a European body that does the same thing, or a similar thing, that measures the amount of greenhouse gases and also the temperature. And so visiting that information on a regular basis reminds me how lucky we are to have made it this far. You know, it was the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, the predecessor to the IPCC, that indicated we cannot exceed 350 parts per million equivalent of carbon dioxide. Equivalent. We've been beyond that mark for a really long time. And you don't see anybody talking about that or writing about that anymore.
You don't.
You know, I suspect you're familiar with the Limits to Growth paper put out in 1972 by the Club of Rome. And there have been at least 3 updates, the latest of which came out on November 3rd, 2020, in the Journal of Industrial Ecology. And it's written by Gaia Harrington. And she writes in there that world food supply is already lagging behind the human population. And so we were wise, you and I, to choose our parents and the place where we were going to be born, because we have yet to experience that decline in food availability relative to the number of people. The state of food security and nutrition in the world 2021, that's the latest available assessment from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, found that between 720 million and 811 million were hungry on a daily basis. Nearly 1 in 3 people did not have access to adequate food at that time. And this is some of the stuff that Harrington quotes in her updated report about limits to growth. It is peer reviewed. And clearly the situation has not improved since 2021. Here we are, a full year afterwards, and things are not getting any better. In fact, I would argue that they're getting worse on a week by week
getting
basis.
worse. So last question, Guy. It must be the case that the people at the top have access to this information. They can't not. If I've managed to get there, they must have it. I'm disconcerted by the number of accidents happening to food production plants, the attempt to derail agriculture in the Netherlands. It's already happened in Sri Lanka with the catastrophic events there. If I wasn't a reasonable person, I would think there were malign actions taking place. That's how it looks to me. Do you have any thought on what's happening in those fields?
Well, if I say something like that, I'm accused of being a paranoid conspiracy theorist.
Oh, yes.
But obviously federal governments know what's going on. And at this point, they're juggling chickens and chainsaws to try to keep the whole system going for as long as they can. Nobody is taking the approach suggested by Ray Bradbury in his 1949 short story, The Last Night of the World, right? In which everybody knew they were going to die. It's the last night of the world. They knew they were going to die in their sleep that very night. We should be so lucky, right?
Yeah.
And so everybody went to bed, and nobody flew across the country, flew west so they could add more time to their lives. They just accepted the situation where they were in. If federal governments of the world had been reporting this information for a long time, I suspect that it might have been easier for the masses to take, and we wouldn't have the outbreaks of violence that we are already seeing as people are starving to death, much less the ones predicted to occur in the future. But
it's going to be medieval, and it's unbelievably heartbreaking to even start to open up to that. It puzzles me beyond belief.
Right.
Like, to reconcile, I know it's coming, but it's unbearable to think of anybody starving to death, never mind the children.
Right. Absolutely. It's a wreck. It's a train wreck.
And Guy, thank you for all you've done. God damn it, you've paid the price for some of us to get the information. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Hope probably makes you a special cookie.
Well, thanks for saying that. Pauline is my special cookie. She has treated me better. She has treated me better than 99.9% of the people on the planet for a long time now. So she saved me. She saves me every day.
Good to hear it. Well, thank you so much, Guy. I feel kind of more settled inside myself to this.
Well, thank you for the conversation today. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.